Every subject matter can encompass this medium, really. Any subject can. Shakespeare in 3D. Imagine Citizen Kane in 3D. I'm serious. I'm not saying do it.
Raising the idea of converting Citizen Kane into 3D sounds like something a villainous studio executive says in a movie so the audience understands how soulless he is. But after the release of 2009's Avatar, Scorsese was promoting his own 3D film, Hugo. And at the time, it seemed like 3D was the future. It wasn't though. Marty just got a little too excited. Turns out, everyone did. But before we dive into the depths of 3D, why not take a moment to subscribe to the Nerdstalgic channel? The idea of 3D images actually predates the medium of cinema, and the most primitive versions date back to the early 19th century. But the effect we generally think of today as 3D goes back to the development of the stereoscope in the early 1830s. Stereoscopes allow a person to simultaneously look at two distinct pictures of a scene, one from a left eye perspective and one from a right eye perspective. The brain unifies the two and sees them as a single three-dimensional image. The stereoscope, though, wasn't designed with cinema in mind, but even among the early pioneers of moving pictures, there were those that saw its commercial potential. The first 3D feature was 1922's The Power of Love. Viewers had to wear red and green glasses to see the 3D and could even choose between two different endings, one happy, one sad, by watching through either the red or green lens alone. Despite this fairly interesting use of the technology and rave reviews, the film was unsuccessful. Over the next several decades, 3D was generally confined to short films. But then, in 1952, Arch Oboler's action-adventure B-movie Moana Devil hit theaters. Filmed with a 3D process called natural vision, its posters trumpeted the tagline, "The miracle of the age, a lion in your lap, a lover in your arms." Despite terrible reviews, Moana Devil was one of the most successful movies of the year. At the time, the movie business was in a state of paranoia over the emerging medium of television. Looking for any edge to help keep the public interested in the theatrical experience, studios took note of the reaction to Moana Devil and the ensuing 3D craze. Buoyed by the implication that the effect could get people to like an otherwise mediocre film, the studios would make 57 3D movies over the next 2 years, including The Creature from the Black Lagoon, House of Wax, and the 3D musical extravaganza, Kiss Me Kate. Even Alfred Hitchcock tried to get in on the action with the 3D film Dial M for Murder. But unfortunately for the director, Dial M was DOA, and desperate theater owners begged Warner Brothers for permission to show the 2D version. Business picked up after the switch, and with that, the 3D craze was pretty much over. Hitchcock himself later reflected on his brief flirtation with 3D, concluding, "It's a 9-day wonder, and I came in on the 9th day." In the early 1960s, use of 3D declined and was generally limited to exploitation films. But then, Arch Oboler, who was apparently something of a proto-James Cameron when it came to boosting 3D movies, released the 1966 sci-fi film, The Bubble. Like his earlier Moana Devil, The Bubble was a flop with critics, but a hit with audiences, and it opened the door for a second wave of 3D films that lasted into the 1970s. In the early 1980s, 3D made a more high-profile comeback, and between 1981 and 1983, audiences were treated to movies like Friday the 13th Part 3, Jaws 3D, and Amityville 3D. Ultimately, this 1980s mainstream resurgence of the effect was as brief as it was memorable, and 3D continued to be regarded by most people as a cheap gimmick used to sell lousy movies. Over the next decade and a half, 3D would increasingly be put to more specialized use, turning up mostly in IMAX movies and theme park attractions. But then, in 2003, James Cameron released Ghosts of the Abyss, a 3D IMAX documentary about the wreckage of the Titanic. Coming on the heels of his cinematic blockbuster about the doomed ship, the documentary brought 3D back into the public eye. Only this time the effect was associated with a high-quality film made by a legendary director. The world didn't know it yet, but Cameron was actually laying the groundwork for a massive public reevaluation of 3D. He was also using the film as a development platform for the technology he would need to make his next movie, the one that would change everything. And while Cameron was busy working on that, a new crop of 3D films hit the box office. Unlike previous 3D waves, these movies were mainstream titles like 2004's The Polar Express and 2008's Journey to the Center of the Earth. They met with varying degrees of success, but their very existence helped to rehabilitate 3D in the public eye. And then, in 2009, James Cameron was finally ready.
Whoa!
By the number.
Jake, listen to me. You're not used to your Avatar body. This is dangerous. This is great.
Jake! Come on, they're gonna put you out.
To say Avatar upped the game when it came to 3D would be a drastic understatement. And as the first real blockbuster to build high-quality 3D into its design, it forever changed the way the public saw 3D movies. And audiences rewarded Cameron by making Avatar the highest-grossing film of all time, surpassing his own Titanic. The message was clear. Audiences were hungry for good 3D movies. And once again, the movie industry took notice. But what they mostly took notice of was the inflated ticket prices they could charge for 3D movies. Formats like Dolby 3D, Master Image 3D, Real D 3D proliferated like no one's business. But James Cameron's dream of a world of movies thoughtfully conceived for and shot in 3D was not to be. Studios just saw what they always did, a gimmick to get people into theaters. Save its own sequel, few, if any, subsequent films had 3D that worked as well as it did in Avatar. In fact, few, if any, of those films were actually shot for 3D at all. Shooting in 3D can be considerably more complicated, time-consuming, and expensive, so most of the post-Avatar 3D releases were shot for 2D and then post-converted, often to less than impressive results. The inferior quality, coupled with the fact that more films were making 3D options a standard part of their release, eventually took its toll on the public, and the gimmick began to see diminishing returns. The number of digital 3D screens in the United States, which had blown up exponentially after the release of Avatar, peaked in 2017 and has been slowly declining since. The general dip in theater attendance in recent years certainly hasn't helped matters, and studios and theater owners are perhaps more worried than they've ever been about keeping people coming out for a uniquely theatrical experience. With 3D ticket sales on the decline, you can bet Hollywood is watching out for another gimmick to coax people into coming away from their home theaters, and that's actually nothing new. Theater gimmicks have been around for decades. For example, some theaters showing 1954's House on Haunted Hill were equipped with a pulley system called Immersion that would move a plastic skeleton across the length of the screen during a corresponding part of the film. The movie was a huge success thanks partly to the gimmick, which was conceived by director William Castle, innovator of several other movie theater gimmicks. The 1960 mystery comedy Scent of Mystery was presented in an experience called Smell-O-Vision. The system would periodically release odors intended to correspond with what was going on in the film's plot. For example, the smell of a particular smoking pipe could tip the audience off as to the identity of the assassin. Unfortunately, the technology didn't work so well. In certain parts of the theater, the scents all blended together, arrived late, or not at all, and the idea was quickly dropped. 1974's Earthquake and a handful of other movies in the 1970s were exhibited to something called Sensurround. In practical terms, this meant that the theaters were outfitted with enormous low-frequency speakers that would literally shake the room. It sounds pretty cool, but turns out Sensurround did structural damage to some of the theaters it was installed in, and that was pretty much the end of that. These gimmicks are just the tip of the iceberg, and while none of them have really survived into the modern era, their descendants are alive and kicking in the form of theater experiences like 4DX, a format that boasts over 20 environmental effects intended to enhance the movie-going experience. These include things like scent sprayers, wind machines, motion seats, strobe lights, and even simulated weather, complete with lightning, rain, and fog. Theaters have also started offering movies in the ScreenX format, which adds digitally expanded screens to either side of the main screen, creating a panoramic view. ScreenX has sometimes been referred to as sideways IMAX. Speaking of which, IMAX, a pioneer in the use of 3D, is also still out there, showing movies in its proprietary 70mm screen format. From a business perspective, Hollywood's preoccupation with finding ways to keep people going to the movies is completely understandable. But while alternate formats and gimmicky experiences can definitely have novelty value, novelty, by definition, wears off. Avatar succeeded because its 3D was more than a gimmick. It was a tool used to add depth and richness to a world that formed the setting for a story people loved. That was the real key. Good old-fashioned storytelling. It's what James Cameron has always been great at, and it's the only gimmick that's gonna keep him coming back. So, what do you think? Are you a fan of 3D? And if so, what's your favorite 3D movie? Let us know down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, you'll definitely find others you like if you check out the rest of the channel. As always, thank you for subscribing to Nerdstalgic.